All right. Well, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the first of our four-part series, Connecting Generations. Today's focus is on environmental collaboration and conflict resolution in Indian country. As I mentioned, we are recording the session today, but that's already been started. And if you want to get access to it, we will be sending that link to all of those that registered later on. My name's Stephanie Lucero. I am a senior program manager with the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. And joining me today is our team, and I'm actually going to turn it over to them to give them a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So Ben, let's turn it over to you first.
Great. I'm Ben Zukowski. I'm calling in here from Michigan, and I will be the tech guru for today. So any questions, feel free to shoot me a message on here. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and look forward to a great session today. Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Cordova. I am the Native American Alaska Native Program Associate for the National Center. My colleagues, Ben and Stephanie here with me today. We're just so glad to have you join us today. We're really looking forward to today's session. And to kick us off, I just wanted to ask everyone to take into consideration and then post in the chat, what are you bringing to today's session? So I like to say in your metaphorical backpack or book bag or briefcase, what did you bring to today's session? So for me, I actually am bringing pieces of my culture from both sides of who I am. So I'm Taos Pueblo and Shoshone Bannock, and also Tusuki Pueblo. So for my Pueblo side, I bring like community and traditional values. And then from my show band side, I bring a long line of leadership and just kind of grounding in our traditional values on that side as well. So if you could just share in the chat, I think Ben has given us an example there already, but what you're bringing to today's session. Thanks. And then I'll let Stephanie lead us after we've gotten some folks posting in the chat.
Thanks, Lauren. And we have the prompt for all of you in the introduction slide right now. Thank you, Will. I think you started us off. Curiosity, I like it. Curiosity is a good thing to bring to today's session as well. As I put in the chat, I'm bringing with me today my years of experience working both in conflict resolution and working in collaboration and conflict resolution in Indian country. And so that is what I bring today. I'm also going to remind folks and encourage you all to, in addition to introducing yourselves in chat, please add any questions or comments you have in the chat box throughout today's workshop and webinar. We will be looking to the chat box to answer questions. Lauren's going to be monitoring that for us. And if for any reason you prefer to raise your hand or share via the microphone or engage in some of the exercises we have for today's session via the mic, please feel free to raise your hand. We are hoping the sound quality is all right. So if we mute you, it's just because there might be some sound issues, and we'll just rely on chat if that happens. So do encourage you to use the chat, but we also have that option. Just please feel free to raise your hand. And just as a reminder, today's session, our goals really are to just provide some fundamentals of what environmental collaboration and conflict resolution is, particularly from the National Center's perspective, but also we have a lot of seasoned professionals that are also joining us today. And I'm encouraging all of my colleagues to feel free to add either in the comments or raise your hand of additional ways to approach ECCR, and particularly environmental collaboration and conflict resolution in Indian country, and what that means for working nation to nation and working for community members within tribal nations. So with that, we've got a couple folks adding in their information. Thank you so much. And we'll just start getting started. We're going to keep admitting folks as we get through. So as we always do at the National Center here, we do want to introduce ourselves a little bit more. We are with the Udall Foundation, and the Udall Foundation is an executive branch agency. It's independent. It was created through Congress, and it was established to honor Morris K. Udall, and then expanded to also honor Stewart L. Udall. So his name was added to the foundation in 2009. And we have a variety of programs within the Udall Foundation. There's a commitment and a mission throughout the Udall Foundation to strengthen federal agencies, as well as the government-to-government relationship and self-determination of Native nations. And key components of that are various programs. We have a very large education program that provides scholarships to those working in the field of the environment and public policy. We also have scholarships to Native youth and the Native American Congressional Internship. One of my favorite pictures we have here is our 2022 Congressional Internship cohort and some of the alumni of that program. We also have a Parks and Focus program, and we work very closely with the University of Arizona's Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and the Native Nations Institute. In addition to those education programs, we also have the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. We're one of the larger programs within the Udall Foundation. And our focus really is on what we're going to be talking about today, which is environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. So the National Center used to be the U.S. Institute, so you may know us by that previous name. We were created by Congress within the Udall Foundation, that executive federal branch, to help federal agencies and other affected stakeholders address environmental disputes, conflicts, and challenges, including helping agencies build internal capacity to address those challenges. That's our congressional mission. It's dictated in our legislation. What that means within the larger Udall Foundation framework is we are a unique program. We provide environmental collaboration and conflict resolution services. We provide training and collaboration. And our focus really is on bringing affected parties in environmental and natural resource conflicts together to collaboratively problem solve. We're really built around this concept of ECCR, environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. Our headquarters are in Tucson, Arizona, which is another unique aspect of the agency. Many of our staff work throughout the country. I am calling from Sacramento, California. Ben shared that he's calling from Michigan. Lauren's calling from Washington, D.C. We have staff throughout the United States. But let's get to ECCR. Today's focus is really, what is ECCR and how might you apply it in Indian country? And what we mean by ECCR is both the definitions that are defined in multiple memos and other items, but also how it's implemented and what it looks like. ECCR defined under the CEQ member, that's the Council for Environmental Quality, for those of you that are not familiar, is third-party assisted collaborative problem solving and conflict resolution. And it's in the context of environmental, public lands, natural resources. We like to share that when we talk about environment, public lands, natural resources, that may also include cultural resources and anything that's connected or related to that relationship with a natural environment. These matters that are defined in CEQ include energy, transportation, water, land management, but it can be fairly broad given that we're talking about the environment, natural resources, public lands. When we say third-party assisted, that is defined under the law as a neutral or impartial. We like to call it a multipartial party. It's basically an individual that has no stake in the outcome or the issue being discussed. Their role really is there to advocate for the process. And that process is really a further definition. That process is people that are interested and affected by a particular conflict working together despite differing views or perspectives or interests, but working together in a systematic and organized way to develop solutions together. It's the people working together to solve those problems. And sometimes that's very complex. It's usually multi-party. There's lots of different content that might come up, lots of different perspectives and views. It's very dynamic. But those are kind of the essentials of it. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But I also want to talk about what do we mean by ECCR in Indian country, right? So well, there's legal definitions of Indian country. And if you're really interested in getting into the weeds of that, I encourage you to join us for our second session that's occurring in March. More details on that to come. But what we mean by Indian country, because we're looking at this broad swath of environmental collaboration and conflict resolution, or ECCR, we're talking about natural lands, public lands, natural resources, environmental issues. That isn't limited to trust or tribal territories as defined under US law. So when we talk about Indian country, we're looking at the more expansive definition of the place where Native people live, Native nations have interests, community Native and Indigenous people have sovereignty or concerned issues. So those could be treaty areas, ceded lands, that could be traditional homelands. So we're looking at a much more expansive view when we talk about Indian country and ECCR application in Indian country. And so I just wanted to make sure we had that grounding. But I also did want to point out that there is also the areas within Indian country as defined under law. Here's the legal definition. I'm not going to read it to you, but that basically is those areas where tribes have sovereign jurisdiction, tribal trust lands, treaty lands, allotted lands. Like I said, if you're really interested in this, join us for session 2. We'll get into more detail. So generally, when we look legally at Indian country, we see this map where the clearly defined definitions of Indian country are. I want you to ignore the designated trust territory lands in this map, but really think about, we're talking about the entire United States. The entire contingent United States as a potential area of Indian country if there are Indigenous communities with interests and affected by particular environmental conflicts. And it's in our name, and I don't want to forget, let's not also forget Alaska as part of Indian country as well. 40 million acres of legal and also just the territories in Alaska that we can't forget. So that's what we mean by Indian country. And if you think about it, it really is about those tribal sovereign nations and the individuals and tribal members that are served by those nations and part of those communities, and then also part of the larger fabric of the US. So let's get back to basic principles of ECCR. So some of the basic principles, and this is on our website if you'd like more detailed, are these kind of bullet points, and I'll explain them in a little bit more detail. So informed commitment is really making sure that the parties within an ECCR process, and I'll be using that acronym a lot. So remember, ECCR is environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. But the parties in an ECCR process have confirmed their willingness and availability to participate. It also includes that they have the authority. They're informed in terms of what that commitment is, that they're participating in good faith. They have an open mindset. They're committed to that process or engaging in that process to the fullest extent of their ability. It also means that there's a balanced and voluntary representation. Balance means all of the affected parties' concerns. It may not mean that you necessarily have every person that's affected there, but their concerns are being brought into the discussion in one way or another. Sometimes we have delegated representatives. Sometimes folks say, I can't come to every meeting, but here's a person I trust to talk to. Or sometimes there's a process where you engage in a larger public and their viewpoints are brought into another forum, right? So it really is about, but it's really about making sure you have all of the parties whose interests or concerns that could be affected by a given decision or ECCR process are represented in some way, and it's balanced. There's also the concept of group autonomy, and that means that all of the parties involved are part of how the decision-making on how that process runs. Either they agree that, yes, this is a process that we agree to and we're invested in, or they help develop it. Like I said, ECCR is very fluid. It can look different ways depending on the situation, but you want to make sure you do have that group autonomy. And sometimes that means how the facilitator is picked, if there's a facilitator, who they are, how they're accountable to the parties and how the parties are accountable to each other. And you can tell I've got accountability is a really important component of that. Everybody's accountable to the process and each other and those folks that they might be representing in that process. An informed process is really gets to everybody has the information needed to have discussions. So that could be sharing of information, agreeing on what information can be shared among the participants. It doesn't mean that confidential information will always be shared, but it's understood that if information isn't shared, everybody agrees on why that is shared or not shared, or how it's shared, or how it might be shared outside of an ECCR forum. You might have a discussion that involves very confidential information, and the parties have an agreement in terms of how they're going to discuss that and share that externally. There's also an openness among the parties as well as those that they represent. So participants in the public are fully informed about the objectives of a given process, any constraints that might be involved, whether in the process or the individual parties. Openness is really about open communication. A willingness to be very transparent is another way we might look at it, but being really cognizant of that. We have timeliness in there, and I want to be very clear, particularly for those of you that are new to ECCR that are joining us today. Collaboration takes time, but you also want to make sure that any process that you're doing is timely with the decisions that you want to impact. So being really cognizant of those timelines, being really cognizant of the time the parties need and the time it will take to develop a collaborative solution is really important to the overall process and a principle, at least from the National Center of ECCR. And then implementation, making sure that whatever you come up with can be implemented. It isn't just talking for talking's sake. It isn't just talking for relationship building. Well, that's a very important part of ECCR. It's really about making sure that the solutions are going to be something that can be implemented and move issues forward. It may not solve all the problems, but it's going to be able to create an agreement among the parties, a commitment among the parties that can be acted on and implemented. So those are just some of the basic principles of ECCR that we look to. And the different ways that the National Center focuses on that. And again, we're just one group that does environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. We have other folks on the line. So speaking from the National Center, in terms of the services we provide as a federal agency that might be different from other folks on the line, but we provide a range of services to forward the concepts of ECCR. And I'm actually going to start from the right to the left. So sorry if that feels a little disjointed, but we, as a federal agency, we convene a forum of environmental collaboration practitioners, specialists, offices within the federal government in thinking through what ECCR means. We also support national conferences. We convene webinars and trainings like the session you're joining us here today. We try to encourage an understanding and use of ECCR where it's appropriate, however appropriate. Similarly, we have a training program. We offer trainings on environmental collaboration and conflict resolution, tribal collaboration and consultation, system design, etc. If you're interested in that, please reach out to Ben. He can put the link on the chat. You can go to our website. But then we also do case services, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in terms of how we do it. And that's assessing a conflict. What is the conflict? Is it ripe for ECCR? Who are the parties and perspectives? Process design, how might a process work for a given conflict or situation or a collaborative objective, convening parties, bringing them together, project management, and then also joint fact-finding, working with parties. Even just joint fact-finding can be highly conflict-ridden or has the potential without the right level of collaboration. And so we might facilitate and support some of that joint fact-finding between parties. So those are just a little ways that we do it. I'll encourage my colleagues on the line that have done this work in other areas. If they want to add to that, please feel free, raise your hand, put it in chat. But I also want to do a pause because we have folks that are new to the field. We have folks that are experienced in the field. If you have any questions or comments, and then also just give us a chance as a group to kind of explore what might be some benefits or barriers to ECCR and using it in Indian country, or examples of where we've seen it work, where we've seen it not work, just to provide some clarity. So I'll pull down this for a minute, although this dog is adorable. And just see if folks have some thoughts on what might be some benefits or barriers to ECCR. I'm checking all the folks we have. Go ahead, Seth. And you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. No, I just thought I'd get us started with a thought or question that I know we've talked about before, but I just think about like one of the barriers to ECCR, which has also come up in just conflict resolution work in general, is the approach. Is it limiting, like in terms of like using an interest-based approach when maybe other things like needs or values or identity might be paramount and more important than an interest-based transaction?
Oh yeah, I see where you're going with that one. I wouldn't call that a barrier, but that's just my opinion. I think that's an opportunity for finding the benefit in process design, right? Like,
Yeah, of course. Wherever there's a barrier, there's an opportunity. I just putting it out there is that's something that's been raised to me sometimes by diverse groups, in terms of expanding the way we think about it, maybe, but it may
yeah.
come across as a barrier at first. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would also say that that spells out for me where ECCR is distinguished from like legal approaches, right? So when you sometimes a court case or litigation is the best approach to deal with a conflict, but if there are values or identity approaches or more ancillary results, that might be where ECCR may be a better fit than litigation or a court case, right? Because it allows you some flexibility in the process to maybe think through how those might be incorporated, assuming, you know, you can fit all the other pieces. So for me, that's where it's kind of that analysis of, is this good for ECCR? Is this good for a similar process to ECCR? Or would, you know, a litigation or a court case be a better outcome? And anybody else have thoughts? This is time for all of us to kind of think through before we move to the next bit. Go ahead, Marcy.
Well, I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of money involved in using ECCR, paying for facilitators and mediators, but for those who are new to this, it's but where there is a federal interest in accomplishing something through an ECCR process, oftentimes the federal agencies will have funds in their budgets that can be purposed for this. So just if you're brand new to this conversation, that's a reality. And also there's a bureaucratic piece about getting a contract in place for a facilitator or mediator. And again, there's ways to overcome that or make that manageable, specifically through the folks like Stephanie or various staff on the Udall Foundation team, and within a federal agency, if you go through a different federal agency, that will help make that workable. Just two realities of the process, but definitely, you know, there's ways through that.
Thanks, Marcy. And some of these are general to ECCR and environmental collaboration and conflict, and not necessarily specific to bringing these tools into Indian country. I would say that in terms of benefits or barriers to ECCR, specifically in Indian country and working with tribal nations, I always try to evaluate whether a barrier can be a benefit or a benefit might be a barrier. But I think one of the aspects is, given the diversity of tribal nations and tribal communities represented by those nations, I see ECCR as an opportunity to think through the right fit for a process in problem solving. And, you know, maybe it's not ECCR, maybe it's, you know, particularly if it's a largely Indigenous issue or community issue, it might be connected to ECCR and, you know, peacemaking and other solutions. And yes, Kurt, I saw your hand go up, which is why I mentioned peacemaking. But I think those types of concepts of thinking through how to create the right fit for a given conflict is really a benefit that I see. And Kurt, I'm going to open up. You saw your hand go up. So did you want to share?
I did, thanks. Seth's comments kind of spurred some thoughts early in my work with circles and circle peacemaking. I talked to a well-known anthropologist in this area, asking how did people work through differences? The original people here, how did they work through differences? And he was quiet for a while, and then he said, well, the first thing you have to think about is if you'd been dropped into this place several hundred years ago before contact with Europeans, and you had run into one of the locals and had been able to communicate, he said they probably would have introduced themselves in terms of who their people were, you know, their clan, their village, where they came from. And then down the road, they might have mentioned a little bit about themselves as an individual. And he said, this has everything to do with how you work through things, is if you see yourself as an individual dealing with something, then going back to Seth's reference to interest-based negotiations, well, whose interest is it? If it's my interest as an individual, that puts me kind of like if you remember the situation of carnivals used to have bumper cars. You know, we're each in our own little bumper car out there with our own interests, and we don't get anywhere. You know, there's a lot of chaos out there. Sometimes it might be fun and comical, but you don't make much progress in that. Whereas if you see yourself as simply a part of something larger, and what is the interest of that larger group? So it really ties into what you were talking about earlier, Stephanie, of the mindset, the worldview, so to speak, that you bring to the conversation. Or is it a collaborative mindset? Is it open-minded? Is it exploring the issue? Or is it there to compete, to see what's in it for me? And I think that also leads to what's the best approach. Is it litigation? I think litigation is probably one of the best approaches we have, if that's the mindset, that everyone comes there individually minded and what's in it for me. If they can be collaboratively minded, then I think these other approaches, these more traditional approaches like the peacemaking circle, really have a lot more to offer. And I think one of the issues we have now is the world by and large defaults to the courts and litigation, whereas it seems like maybe those should be more of a later option if collaboration simply doesn't work out, simply can't work out. So that's all I had. Thanks.
Thanks, Kurt. I really appreciate that. And when you were speaking about the individual versus the larger group, it kind of reminded me about, you know, the principles of ECCRs, making sure that it isn't just one or two people figuring out a solution, but really thinking through about everybody that could be impacted, or thinking through in this particular situation. The way I approach it in this particular situation, you know, we are a community. So who's the member of the larger human community that might be impacted by this conflict, and how might their interests need to come into this discussion? So I really appreciate that, because that helped me think through also some of the benefits of ECCR in terms of the parties. So I'm going to encourage folks, if they have some other thoughts in terms of benefits of using environmental collaboration and conflict resolution generally or specifically in Indian country, please put those in the chat box. We have I have a slide. It doesn't include all of what we just discussed, but here are some additional benefits that we think about in terms of using environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. It talks a little bit about some of these, you know, productive working relationships. I think creating those relationships between individuals and communities, buy-in and commitment to solutions, I think also gets into the concept of, is it a process that everybody feels heard and part of, and it's looking more collaboratively versus more individual views and interests, but really thinking through the larger community. So these are just some opportunities. I mentioned the creative solutions are possible, both in terms of process and outcomes, and really thinking through all of these other components that we see in terms of benefits of using ECCR. And in terms of relating that to working in Indian country, what we've seen in terms of when ECCR works in Indian country writ large, right, is when we're talking about a manageable number of affected or interested parties. And this really gets to an environmental collaboration or conflict resolution process usually involves bringing parties together to resolve the issue amongst themselves. And you need a workable group of folks or representatives to do that. And so I think having that is really important. There's also components of, and I'll provide some examples. Sarah, I saw your question, your hand, and your comment about, experiences of specific ECCR processes.
Thank you.
No problem. But where I've seen it helpful is when there is a manageable number of folks that can work together in developing solutions. So for example, I've seen ECCR processes of larger kind of national perspectives where there are certain ideas, but there needs to be some development of recommendations or application within a more localized area, and using either a group or an advisory group or committee that works through some of those recommendations in application of like a national policy on a local level. So that's one example where that manageable, affected, interested parties, and also being really cognizant that there might be national concerns that affect everybody, but how that's implemented, and remember that's the principle of ECCR, how that's implemented on a local basis is going to be developed by the people that are affected by those things locally. So that's one example, and I promise to provide more. The decision makers, so where this works and where this doesn't work, and I think we talked a little bit about this or referenced it, the decision makers are committed to utilizing the input from the collaborative group, right? ECCR is not just intended to have folks think of solutions. They have to be implementable, which means you need the buy-in, you need the commitment from the folks that will be making the decisions. So when we do an assessment or analysis, is ECCR a good fit? One of the first questions we ask is, what's the commitment of decision makers in terms of what is developed will be the final outcome, or will inform the final outcome. And that gets to the transparency and openness. Always making sure that the affected parties, people who care about the issue, have an opportunity to make an impact in the outcome. And that might be they're in the room problem solving with others. That might be that they're informing their representatives. And when I say representatives, I mean community members, community advocates, community leaders. Could be some of those representatives. It could even be federal agency staff who have the trust of a community member to bring those concerns. I've seen that happen as well. But another really important component of this, and I think this gets to some of what you were saying, Kurt, and what we were talking about, is that ECCR can be helpful when there are relationships involved. Community members, neighbors, cross-jurisdictional issues where there's an opportunity to ensure that the conflict will not adversely impact one-on-one relationships and experiences. So those are areas where it might be super helpful to use. And Sarah, I know you had an interest in hearing experiences from folks who've been part of specific ECCR process, whether as an advocate, stakeholder, or neutral. And I'm actually going to turn to Marcy and see if you want to share, because you mentioned, Marcy, in the chat, experiences with ECCR processes. But before I do that, Sarah, did you want to add anything to that question or thought?
Oh, I'm really appreciative. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't interrupting at the wrong moment. But yeah, that I'm very curious, especially, in our tribal setting, how this has played out for folks on the ground.
Absolutely. Do you want to go ahead, Marcy, and share some examples?
Yeah, I could share one example and more if people want them, but in a number of people on the line have had some involvement with a big project called Mr. Rick, the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, which is pertains to endangered species recovery in the Missouri River. And there's a very large committee that's been working together for many years, 15 years maybe, on developing consensus recommendations to the Army Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service about how to support recovery of these 2 endangered species with minimal impact on human uses of the Missouri River. And there's about 29 tribes, as I recall, that are have been invited to be participants at the table in that consensus building effort, and another 30 or so other kinds of parties involved. And we have an independent science advisory group that serves the whole enterprise in terms of answering scientific questions, and to avoid a battle of the experts, more or less, by everybody having different experts involved in the process. And there are 7 designated seats on that independent science advisory panel, and we recently added one of those 7 was added about 2 years ago, that was specifically about indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And so we did that intentionally to provide a focal forum for talking about what is important information to factor into decision making or consensus building on that topic, the endangered species recovery, and not just adding a seat to the panel for that purpose, but experimenting with different ways of that expert carrying out their duties, whereas some of the more Western type experts just sort of do it based on their academic training. The indigenous expert does it more through outreach to the tribes involved, and acting as a channel for bringing in the knowledge of these multiple tribes, so that one expert doesn't speak for those tribes, but provides a channel for those tribes to share their knowledge. So that's just one example where, it's an ongoing learning process. It's way far from perfect, but we're working on this in multiple dimensions within this project.
Thanks much for sharing that.
You bet.
I'm wondering if anybody has used ECCR in connection with a specific dispute too.
I've had experience in a wide range that I can share.
Oh, great.
So we've had situations, for example, there was a repatriation issue where the tribal community didn't actually have access to their traditional homelands. So I facilitated a dialogue to where, when you look at that and assess who's the parties, who needs to be in the dialogue, it wasn't just a matter of, the parties directly related to the current possession of those remains and the repatriation. It was also about talking to federal and state land managers who might have the authority and access to those public lands or traditional homelands for the repatriation. So that was a very clear, smaller, insular group of an ECCR process where we needed to bring the parties together and identify some workable solutions. There's lots of different issues that come about with that. And so that was just one easy example I can think of at the top of my head of an ECCR, very insular. I've also done a lot of work, both as an advocate and then later as an ECCR professional. I got into this field because I was an advocate, and my job, in my opinion, as an advocate, was creating a space for Indigenous voices to speak with their counterparts. And so, lots of other professionals are like, you should be doing this. So there was a situation of developing recommendations for forest management and national policies and rules. And there were different roundtables and groups and design processes associated with how different regions or forests would would inform that policy and implement it in their own plans, in their own management plans, and even in their relationships. And I was reaching out to someone else on the phone. There's also been like a ton of work in just working with Indigenous organizations in kind of that ECCR framework as kind of advocates, but also possible representatives, and how to work through that is something where I've seen ECCR as a really powerful resource to facilitate dialogue across and shared learning across different expanses. So hopefully that helps. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned you might have an example to share, so it's not just folks from the National Center sharing. Go ahead.
You mean me, right? You've got two Sarahs.
Yeah. I do have two Sarahs. Sorry, Sarah Palmer.
That's all right. Hi. So several examples, Sarah Van Norman, that I've been involved in that are disputes. One of them was we used a mediator to settle a dispute between a tribe and BIA over interpretation of a settlement language in their document, and it related to some water rights allocation. So that was kind of a classic, if you will, two-party mediation that was used. Another one that was really interesting was a matter that involved trespass of a mining company who made a road onto tribal reservation lands, and the regional director of BIA had signed off on it at the time. The tribe had appealed or challenged the decision of the regional director. And when that happens, for folks that are less versed in the machinations of Interior Department, those kinds of things go to the Interior Board of Indian Appeals. And the IBILA, or IBIA as we refer to it, they can have parties, if they choose, they can go to mediation. And in this case, the tribe, the IBIA referred them to mediation or recommended it. It came to us 14 years later. And they mediated and it got settled. And then we've done a third one where, again, it went through Indian Board of Appeals, and it involved a waste management company on reservation lands that had reneged on its contract. And the challenge there was that the waste management company was owned by a Canadian company. And it was a publicly owned company, and they could not get their board to agree to the settlement that they had worked so hard to negotiate with the mediator or through the mediator with the tribe. So that one failed. And then an older one that's very interesting is sometimes the Department of Interior and our bureaus are reluctant to mediate. And so that's an occasion where litigation can be a really good leverage to get folks to the table. And that was the case where a tribe wanted to mediate some issues around the accounting of their tribal trust asset claims. So this was pre-Cobell, and the Interior Department was loath to do that. The tribe sued, they went to mediation, they got a settlement.
Right.
So lots of examples that way. And Stephanie, I would just make another add-on to your slide about things that are really important in these processes is that they be co-designed. And one of the things that we did while I was still at the Udall Foundation was we co-designed with representatives from tribes, multiple tribes, and DOT for Department of Transportation, Federal Highways for Tennessee, a workshop. And all the tribes that no longer reside in Tennessee, which reside in present-day Oklahoma, wanted to be engaged in this. So we co-designed that workshop for them to talk about how TDOT could engage them effectively to protect tribal resources and that were impacted by roadway projects in Tennessee.
was very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate the perspective and the breadth of the applications that you've had. Yeah, with the model.
Thanks, Sarah and Sarah, both for the question and the examples. As you were speaking, Sarah Palmer, you reminded me of another component that we often see is, and I actually have a slide on that, but where ECCR comes in after litigation's occurred, right? So sometimes the litigation might be a leverage, or ECCR wasn't something that was available at the time or understood at the time. And so there's the litigation to get the parties to the table, so to speak. But then that litigation or decision is usually just going to outline the legal rights. The parties still have to figure out how to implement. And so ECCR comes in to help them work together and how to implement that. So that's another avenue. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned one of those, but just another consideration in terms of the breadth of application. So I'm going to go back to the slides, but if folks have additional thoughts, we're going to keep giving you examples and talk about these different opportunities. So those are certain situations where it could be helpful. And then we've also got situations where ECCR might not be helpful. So we talked a little bit about where, legal rights or litigation may be the better approach, or the parties believe that that's a better approach, right? Part of ECCR is folks need to be committed to using that as their first go at resolving a conflict. You might have a situation where the key parties don't want to participate. Either they don't feel like they have authority, they don't feel like they have to, they're not uninterested, the relationships are so conflict ridden that it just doesn't make, they can't participate in good faith. And that's some of the things we do in terms of an assessment. The other component is thinking through whether the decision makers have the authority to take the input received in an ECCR process to change the decision, right? It could be a situation where the decision is already made, or the authority or desire is not available. And I do want to preface that it's not a matter of good intentions from decision makers. It's really about whether or not decision makers are empowered, either in legislation, processes, protocols, etc., to incorporate the decisions of the affected parties in an ECCR process, whether it be the tribe in consultation, whether it be multi-party, tribe, state, local, the public, in an ECCR or similar collaborative process, whether that input can affect the decision, right? So that it's really not only the good intentions, but kind of the legal constraints. And so we've got a good question in chat, which I'm actually going to come up with this next slide. And this is just a spectrum of conflict, so to speak, in terms of where we might see the application of ECCR. And I think we already provided some of these examples. So this is just a recap of what we've already shared, where the ECCR applications might come in. So that downstream, we call it downstream. It's a little harder to get to it downstream. It's a little more work intensive conflict resolution work downstream, where you've got high conflict. It really is a matter of facilitating and assisting in a negotiation and a mediation. There's a lot less space for the creative problem solving because you're already high in conflict. Maybe there's already been decisions made. There's already issues. The conflict is plainly evident. Is that kind of downstream. And then moving towards the left, you've got kind of conflict prevention and management. I think Sarah Palmer provided an example of a workshop, where is that kind of that training, that collaboration, that co-development of a capacity building or process design. And then as we go farther upstream is where we see ECCR used in collaborative policymaking and decision-making. So cross-jurisdictional decision-making, policy dialogues, rulemaking, where we can see some of these collaborative or conflict resolution tools utilized to create processes and initiate early collaboration. So one of the questions we have is experiences of using ECCR in Indian country when there's looming timelines and a real sense of urgency to resolve the issues. And I will say, only because we are going to get to examples shortly, In those situations, I've seen those timelines be either a barrier or a benefit. And it really depends on just how tight those timelines are, the breadth of the topics, and the urgency. So where I've seen those timelines being a benefit is where it pushes people to prioritize and doing that informed commitment to a collaborative process, where they're engaged and energized to sit and problem solve because they want to either avoid litigation, they want to make sure that that input gets into a decision-making process. They want to make sure that there's a collaborative component to fact-finding or policy development. So in that sense, some of the timelines can be a benefit, assuming that within that timeline, you have the parties identified, they're engaged, they're resourced to sit and develop some solutions, design a process, etc. Where I've seen the urgency, their sense of urgency, and those looming timelines can be a hindrance is where there's just not the time to do the collaboration, where there's a sense that the collaboration might take too long. There's an uncertainty of who even all the affected parties are. A lot of the work that needs to be done in a good collaborative process just isn't there. And that's some of the assessment tools that we're going to be sharing later today. And considerations that you look at in, is ECCR the right fit? And that's really in evaluating whether that timeline can be a benefit or a barrier to a collaborative process. So on that note, and also just generally, we've shared a couple of these, but I'd like us to explore both examples where some of our seasoned professionals have examples of where ECCR applies in Indian country, but I'd also encourage some of you that are here to listen and learn or explore. If you're willing, you don't have to give us specific facts, but do you have an example where ECCR might apply that you think might be, this might be a tool to use? So I'm going to turn off the screen and just explore with that. Any examples that folks want to share where ECCR may apply or where they're wondering if ECCR applies? Or clarifying questions? Julie, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, took me a minute to get that button pushed. Sarah, I see you raised your hand. I defer to you if you would like to go first. No, okay. So I'm wondering about, we have a long-standing conflict. There's a fair amount of frustration and emotions on both sides. Assumptions about ulterior motives, assumptions about, on both sides. And I'm also almost wondering, I'm not sure if ECCR would be the best fit, but I almost wonder if having some assistance to kind of scope that even might help move the dialogue forward, even if it turns out that ECCR isn't the best. Like maybe it would lead us to figure out, okay, do the decision makers have the discretion, do the things that you were listing that kind of have to be present, like what's not. So I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
Absolutely. And I'll defer also to some of my other colleagues on the phone, but I would say, in my opinion, I think even the assessment process of an environmental collaboration conflict resolution can be really helpful. Right? Because you're talking to the different parties, you're getting the different perspectives, you are doing that evaluation of do the decision makers have the authority, who needs to be involved, is there a willingness to collaborate? Like even that process can be very eye-opening in terms of whether to move a conflict forward. Mm-hmm. So that's my opinion. I don't know if some of my other colleagues have a thought, and I'll see if Sarah, you have an additional thought just because you had your hand up. Dana, your hand went up, so I'll see. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Just kind of on, I guess we have a kind of an example of an assessment, and when that hopefully became a vehicle for kind of moving things forward. It's still maybe early to say, but yeah, there was certainly a situation where we talked to the parties involved, and we found that a couple of some of the key things were missing. Like, for example, there was a key party that wouldn't be willing to participate in the discussion as it was currently framed because they had another overriding issue that was to them like way more important than what the agency wanted to talk about. So like that was one thing. There were a couple of other issues like, as Stephanie pointed out, it's really important that the decision makers are willing and able to kind of make changes, to incorporate the input they receive, and that was like not clear at that point that the agency was actually going to be willing or able to do some of the, address some of the issues that were coming up. So there were these, kind of several big concerns, which made us say, okay, it's not ready, this situation isn't ready for collaboration on this particular topic. It might change if, some of these components change, then maybe the situation will shift. I think that having given that, sort of delivered that assessment, my understanding is that now some of the conversations are starting to happen around the issues that needed to be addressed. So, like I said, it's a little early to tell, but we're thinking it, maybe that is an answer, Julie, that it's starting to play that role. So.
Thanks, Dana. And Sarah, I'm going to turn to you now because I know you had another question or comment. Go ahead.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer for folks as well, Stephanie, the tee up that you did at the very beginning about what is ECCR, I just wanted to reinforce a point that you made too, which, you tied it to the CEQ OMB memo, and at Interior in the Office of Collaborative Action and Dispute Resolution, we have a little bit more flexibility because our mandate is broader and our mission is broader. And so for our office, we like to think about ECCR in a very broad context. So any process that touches a tribe, we cater or are open to using the practices and approaches of ECCR to assist participants if that's a pathway that they want to take. So it could be any kind of matter that involves a tribal government or others. So just wanted to flag that we can be more expansive because of the difference in a mission.
I appreciate that, Sarah. And Lauren, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'll just share it. So one of the things that hopefully this might help folks who attendees who aren't sure like if ECCR would work in any given situation. One of the things that I was struck by when I first started working in this field, I remember when I got hired by the Udall Foundation, I didn't even know what ECCR was. And then once it was explained to me, I was able to put it into kind of like this frame of reference where I thought about my tribe, Taos Pueblo's Blue Lake fight. So we had a sacred site, or we have a sacred site called Blue Lake, and that's actually on Mount Wheeler is what I guess the non-native term for it would be. But basically it was taken away from us and put into the Kit Carson National Forest in, I'm not really sure when that was, but there was this long fight for a number of years from our tribe trying to get it back. And it was actually returned to us by Richard Nixon, of all people. And that was something that, when I was growing up, was something that my family talked about a lot. Like sometimes you have allies or you get help with a dispute resolution from the most unexpected places, right? And so when I joined this field and started working for the Udall Foundation, I was thinking about that particular situation. And I was thinking about how that situation could have been helped along probably a lot better using ECCR, because we as Taos Pueblo people were just kind of like, I don't want to say like not taken seriously, but it seemed like our fight just went on and on and on. And it wasn't something that, we wanted to pursue litigation for. It wasn't something that we wanted to really even be bothered with. Like it was something that every Taos Pueblo person, rightfully so, thought of as like, well, why are we even in this situation? This doesn't make sense. Like this is our, it's literally like where we believe our souls go when we die. So for a place like that to be just taken without any explanation or any sort of like authority, I guess, like it just didn't make sense. So essentially, I remember talking to a couple of my colleagues and being like, oh, I get it now. I get what ECCR is, because it would have been useful in that situation. So just for attendees who are like, oh, maybe I don't really get this. Like maybe you already know about a situation where this toolkit that we're about to provide you could help. Or maybe you are already kind of like familiar with disputes or situations that, ECCR, you're doing different pieces of environmental conflict resolution. You're just not aware of it. So I think once folks kind of like have the tools in front of them, and then throughout these subsequent webinars, all of the pieces start to fit together, I think it's a really powerful tool. And I think it's something that can be applied to many different situations, not just, the stories that folks are sharing here. Like it's almost like a something to have in your back pocket. Like, oh, I know how to do ECCR. Maybe some of the pieces of that apply to this situation here.
We honestly didn't plan this, but that's a great segue to the next couple slides. Thanks, Lauren. So speaking of tools, and we're going to give you a movement break shortly, but I do want to share a couple tools with y'all. And, thinking through examples where ECCR, and I think both Sarah and what Lauren shared is, we call it environmental collaboration, conflict resolution here at the National Center, but it is also just collaboration and conflict resolution tools and kind of those concepts and how they apply to day-to-day interactions. So one way to look at it, and we talked a little bit about this, we will have these slides available if folks want to take a look at it later. But it's really about assessing the situation. We talked a little bit about how that can be helpful, even when you're just trying to figure out if ECCR might work, or to get parties to the mindset of a collaborative environment, and really evaluating what are the perspectives, what are the interests, what are the expectations of the parties involved and the community members in terms of resolution and how this should happen and who needs to be part of it. Then there's about bringing the parties together. And I see a lot of community advocates and Indigenous peacemakers already doing this piece, right? Where you're bringing parties together in a collaborative environment to identify the goals, develop a process. This gets to what Sarah was emphasizing earlier, co-developing a process and design for a resolution. And really being responsible and accountable to each other, both as parties to that process, but also maybe within a given community or area. And then through that process, facilitating a solution, coming up with an agreement on what is the criteria for making decisions? How does that criteria meet the interests of all the affected parties? What are some of the options? And, it can be about being really creative about options and not being stuck to certain mindsets or world perspectives, but really thinking through what are the options that will meet the needs and the interests and the concerns of all the parties affected. And then working together to implement any agreements and evaluating the effectiveness of that. So this is generally just the framework we've already talked about. We've focused a lot, today's focus, we are focusing a lot of assessment to get a better idea of what are the issues, the surrounding circumstances, what are the tension points, why might people not be agreeing, what authority the decision makers might have and be willing to incorporate the thoughts of the given process, and also whether or not a collaborative process is the most likely pathway to success, right? You don't want to convene parties just for the sake of getting everybody together to talk. You want a collaborative process that can result in a successful meeting of the minds or development of agreements and recommendations. These are just certain examples of the types of conflicts that we often see and engage with in an environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. And I encourage you all to kind of think through these as your tool of kind of assessing, is this, what are the reasons for this conflict? What are the pathways to success? Who are the parties that we need to bring into the table? Are those parties willing to sit around the table and work through these solutions together? And these can be political, value-based, as Seth and Kurt both mentioned earlier today. They can be organizational constraints, as Sarah and others shared about, like, the authority that decision makers have, and I shared as well. They could be relationship problems. It could be communication and struggles. It could also be data challenges, too much or too little, or not the right data, or the data was collected without asking the right questions. We hear this a lot with the incorporation of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in decision-making. And so these are all different sources of conflict that might come out and be part of the assessment you take in figuring out what are the root causes of this conflict and how can we find a pathway to success. And then the final little tool I'll give you, and all of these, there's much more in depth, but we just want to give you a snapshot of different considerations. But when we look at an ECCR process design and how we manage it, we really want to make sure we're looking at, we call this the triangle of satisfaction. That's what was developed by, this is a long-standing tool. We didn't develop at the National Center, but triangle of satisfaction, what are the objectives of a given process? What's the goal? What do we want to achieve? And in order to achieve those goals, you have to be really cognizant of the people. Remember, respectful inclusion of all the affected parties in one way or another, right? It doesn't mean they're sitting at the table necessarily, but they're represented, their views are represented, and they feel represented in that circle. How it's done, what is the process? Is it a peacemaking circle? Is it an advisory group? Is it a technical group? Is it a small mediation? All of the different ways that you've heard shared today, what is that process? How is it done? Does it best meet the needs of the people and the issues that we're hearing about? And also just making sure that the content is specific. I think Dana mentioned this in her assessment of making sure that that content, the right conversations are happening. Are the issues that need to be addressed to resolve the relational conflict, the intergovernmental conflict, the issues that are being discussed? And can those issues be discussed and that content get moved forward? And so this is just another little tool and kind of foundational component of what we look at in ECCR. It's kind of exciting and dynamic, but just thinking through all of those pieces in development. And so we've got a little bit more, but and we are going to do a quick break, but I just want to see, are there any questions that folks have still, particularly for folks that are really new to this and kind of sitting there from a foundational standpoint? And if you're joining us via email or via video later on, Ben's going to put an email address that you can send questions to if you're watching this and have questions in preparation for later sessions. But for those in the room, any questions, clarifications? All right. Either everybody's ready for a movement break, or we've just been really good at laying those foundations. So I'm going to say we've been really good at laying the foundations. But if more questions come to you, no problem. Before we go to the movement break, just to keep you enthralled, so your movement break doesn't you running off, we have a quick poll. So quick question, because in our minds, these are the questions on whether some of the tools we're sharing will be beneficial to you. So Ben, if you can launch that poll really quickly. So first question, have you ever lived in a community or experienced ongoing disputes or conflicts that never seem to get resolved? Yes or no? And this feels like a quick, easy answer. If you do answer yes, I encourage you to answer the second poll, which is, do those conflicts impact relationships within the community and neighboring communities? This can be your individual community, your neighborhood, your household, your tribe, your city, and your neighboring communities, those that live near you, next door, etc. And not everybody needs to vote, but I'll give you 10. Get your vote in. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So I think we got all as much as everybody, at least half of you answered the poll, so that's great. Most of you would agree you live in communities or experience ongoing conflicts. So I encourage you to stay because we will walk through some of the questions and tools. If you have a conflict, it could be an environmental conflict, it can be any conflict. Think through. We are encouraging folks to bring us conflicts to assess and evaluate. And there's one person who said that the conflicts don't impact relationships. I am very grateful to you that it is a unique quality of person and community that can remove some of other conflicts to their interrelational effects. It is possible. If you're not a facilitator, you might want to consider it in terms of thinking through that. But yes, you can tell these are fairly weighted. We hope you will stay. I'm going to give you all about a minute or two. I will be flexible with that, but I encourage you all. We're going to go off camera just to do a quick stretch. We've been on the phone for about an hour, and we'll be back in a minute or two. Think about those possible conflicts or situations you want to have us work with you on assessing. So here's your timer for your break. And after the movement break, we're going to do a toolkit. So this is our movement break. It's not this, don't leave. But hopefully you'll be back soon. All right. Hopefully you all got a little bit of a stretch, stood up, got the wiggles out. And the last bit of time we have today, we did go through a lot of different examples, but we want to just walk through a couple of scenarios for you all in terms of utilizing some of the assessment tools we shared today. Our intent was to give you some tools to walk home with, and hopefully we've covered some of those. I will encourage the folks that are new to ECCR, if you have examples, to please raise your hand or plop those in. It doesn't need to be specific, so you can give us some generics. But all other of our seasoned folks, if you have some examples that you think might be useful to share, please feel free. And really what we're looking at are what are some conflicts, environmental, natural resource, or if you want to look at something else that you would be interested in exploring, whether or not environmental collaboration and conflict resolution or collaboration and conflict resolution skills and tools would be useful. So do we have any takers of folks that are interested in kind of sharing or walking through examples?
I can give you something.
I was hoping you would, Sarah. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, gosh, I mean, I'm thinking of, I've got several, I work as an attorney. I mostly work for tribes, and I'm in private practice, and I handle a number of land-related matters and environmental matters. And I am so frequently frustrated by the challenges I run into in navigating with federal agencies touching those issues. I feel like, or I'm wondering, like, it's so dependent upon the strength of personal relationships and those can change so much, how easy it is to navigate or even have good quality conversations about what I would view as the most basic steps oftentimes. I don't know whether ECCR is a place for addressing that or setting up opportunities for relationships, but I frequently want there to be a setting outside of a specific dispute, if at all possible, which it isn't possible. I think other Sarah's example of, and maybe somebody else was also talking about how, people redirect, if there's a major issue that's on a council's mind when we sit down for a consultation with an agency, whether or not that's actually on the agenda, it's gonna come up and it's going to be central, and it's not the elephant in the room. It is whatever takes up the whole room and everybody. There's no way to avoid, and that's just an indicator of clash of process a lot of the time, I think. Yeah, so I don't really know what I'm suggesting, but like, is there a space for ECCR to be useful in getting us into better relationships, so when our disputes come up, we can actually navigate them instead of have them fester or wait until somebody retires or wait until a judge forces everyone to do something?
Yeah, and obviously, for the seasoned folks that want to jump in, please feel free. I think there is, and it really just depends on the facts of the given dispute or situation. Those disputes that take up the air when you're thinking it's not the elephant, it's kind of the everything. Like, there are definitely those issues that take up the air. And I think just generally speaking, some of the questions we had on the slide, and I'll share those really quickly. It's really about having those questions analyzed, right? Who are the affected parties? Is it, multi-party? Is it just one party or group of individuals? Is it just the tribe and one federal agency? Is it multiple federal agencies? Like, very often there might be situations where it's not just one agency, or the agency that you might have the ear of may not be the decision maker or have the complete authority to resolve the issue. So that could be like, who are the affected parties to be thoughtful of? The timing, is there time for a collaborative sphere? And particularly if you've got those tense conflicts and interpersonal conflicts, those are going to sometimes take even more time just to get folks in a space to communicate. But I would say where I've seen it beneficial is where folks can see an end to the outcome. So it's not the only resolution is to get a legal finding.
Mm-hmm.
As an attorney, I'm sure those can take a lot of time and money, and sometimes the result is not the outcome that the community wants, right? It's just a confirmation of what the legal rights are. And if you can't get folks to the table until you come up with that, then that might be, hey, this is going to be the best solution. But if it's a situation where that's just a stumbling block to getting and co-developing a solution between the federal agency or the state or the tribe, it might be worthwhile to do that, because you can start picking apart the implementation pieces. I've been in situations where there are legal issues. Water, how much water rights is there? Who gets the water rights? Those are issues that nobody wants to resolve and can't resolve within the next, 10, 20 years in some cases. And they might not want to do a mediation on that, but they want to talk about, well, we're not really talking about the water amount. What we need to talk about is how we're dealing with this watershed, because it's impacting salmon populations, the heat, it's affecting our ability to have enough water within the stream. And so they say, let's take away those legal issues and let's talk about how we manage this area together, understanding that we can't resolve that conflict, but we can talk about how we do this watershed management, right? So that's a situation where I've seen there's a tough relationship. There's still some conflicts about those rights, but the parties working through that objective that they both have, we need a better management of the watershed, are actually able to better improve their relationships from a government to government side as well as an individual party side. There's outcomes and accountability. So that's one example I've seen, Sarah, and I don't know if others have other examples or if that helps.
I do appreciate that. I mean, I'm thinking about really like how can ECCR be a tool for relationship building prior to or somehow separate from, if it's possible, from a dispute, or how can even, I mean, the folks that, let's just take EPA, you know, and I'm forgetting the acronym already, but you know, the access to mediators and facilitators that is possible, that EPA has, like, to use to say, okay, how can we set, I mean, and everybody talks about the context of MOUs and trying to navigate towards a specific product. We need relationships for any of this to happen. And we don't have them oftentimes, or we have them only because of particular staff people who get along, or a moment of a leadership that gets along between a region and a particular council or something, you know. It's happenstance. And I would love different kinds of opportunities, especially ones that are particularly facilitated by the feds. And I mean, there are some of those things. We have consultations, we have standard timing for those things, both as a matter of state agency relationships and certain federal relationships, but they're not facilitated oftentimes. And we don't get to the things we need to oftentimes. So I don't know. I see some hands and I'm hoping people have some things to suggest.
Yeah. I will say, in terms of what you were sharing, definitely if you've got those relationship conflicts, it's really worthwhile to encourage bringing in a facilitator, right? And a mediator, and saying, you know, we need a third party. We need a process design to help with this. And there's lots of federal agencies that have those services. Encouraging the tribe to be part of identifying what criteria needs to happen, right? Do you need a culturally appropriate facilitator? Do you need someone who understands the language? Do you need someone who understands the historical context? Those are things that need to be shared, and kind of even identifying that. So those are like some pre-assessment tools you can use in evaluating whether to say, let's bring in a facilitator. And I will say ECCR can definitely be used for relationship building. It can't only be there for the purposes of relationship building. It needs to be connected, you know, thinking through that triangle of satisfaction slide. The people and the relationships, whether it's the governmental relationships or the individual ones that you're talking about, that's an important piece. But if you don't have a good process and you don't have good content, your end result is not going to be as successful, right? You can't just say, oh, we'll use ECCR to improve the relationships, but we're still not dealing with the content, because people won't have trust in the process then. So that would be where I would say it can be used, but it's part of the larger picture. So I'm going to go to Kurt and then Seth. Kurt, go ahead.
Thanks. This is interesting, talking about building relationships prior to coming together to discuss something specific. And this reminds me, I mean, going back to, well, I'm doing a training in next week, actually in the next few weeks, with some people who are interested in incorporating peacemaking circles into schools. And although I haven't been largely involved with my work with schools, I mean, somewhat, but I'm aware of other folks that have just taken it to heart and incorporated the process into what happens in schools and classrooms, to the extent where in a classroom, they would start the day with a circle. They would end the day with a circle. If issues came up, people would be, the student body, everyone in the school would be accustomed to this process, and they would naturally bring issues to a circle, something like this. Now, this rarely happens in this day and age with when issues come up, and something like what you all try to do. I'm sure you run into people to where this is a pretty strange animal. I mean, I think Lauren was mentioned this earlier at her first exposure. She didn't know what this was about. And you know, thinking of animals, you know, if you've grown up in Alaska, where I have, and you're accustomed to well, occasionally being aware of Wolverine around or something like that. And then suddenly you're dropped in a completely foreign place like Australia that you have no knowledge of, and you run into a koala bear. You're probably going to have a lot of concern about, okay, what's this thing like? What's this thing going to do to me? You know, and I get that all the time with conflict resolution, with peacemaking circles, because you're dealing with people who their whole experience has been with something completely different, and they don't know what this is, and that just leads to fear. So I don't think this is an easy answer to what Sarah was talking about of building relationships ahead of time. I think that's hugely important and hugely valuable and really difficult. Really difficult. I think the challenges that we all have with what we try to do are pretty significant. But so I think it takes time and patience and staying the course and some risk, you know, taking some risk to try something when you're not sure how it's going to go, how it's going to feel, what it's going to feel like. And the last thing I want to mention is, you know, I've had the opportunity over the years to do several hundreds of circles, and they're not magical. They don't all work out. But the interesting thing is some of them that have completely fallen apart, I've had the participants come up to me later, sometimes years down the road, and say, you know, what we did there changed everything. It made all the difference in the world. But at the time we were doing it, the folks weren't ready for that. But, you know, what they did is they learned something about it. And, you know, I often try to, and you talk about preparing for something like this, you meet with people, you talk to them, you try to explain what it's like. Maybe some of you are better at this than me, but I have a very hard time explaining to people what it's like to be in a peacemaking circle, you know, what it feels like, where it can go. But if they're actually in one, then they have the chance to have that experience. And you can't unhear the things that you hear there, even if your arms are crossed and you've got an attitude about it and you're not going to let this go anywhere. You can't unhear it. And maybe it's later in bed that night, or maybe it's a year later, a light bulb goes on. So that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Kurt. I think you emphasized a really important thing that we're hoping to accomplish, at least with this webinar series, is getting folks used to the concept of ECCR, so it's not so new and unusual, but it's a long-term process. We are pretty close to time, and Seth, I know you had your hand up, but I'm hoping maybe we can encourage you to bring your example at our March 24th session, if you're available.
I'm afraid I'm actually out of town that day, unfortunately, but that's okay. Ben can bring it, and I can talk to him about it because it's something we're working on together. But I think there's actually some interesting lessons learned there. One of them being that if you're going to call it an ECCR process, you probably need to really explain that to the group and the members so they understand it. Like, you know, one quick example that happened in a last meeting we had was, you know, one of the groups was like, you should, as a facilitator, need to call out that person for not explaining things more. It's like, but we weren't aware of that issue because we're, you know, more playing that impartial or multi-partial role. So we need to empower them to be able to ask the challenging questions and bring those issues to the forefront of their other parties. But yeah, we can talk about it more next time, but thanks.
Thanks, Seth. And we will hold Ben to share with that on March 24th, which is the segue to remind you this is the first of 4. We will be creating different tools and discussions on environmental collaboration and conflict resolution. March 3rd, we will be talking a little bit more specifically about federal Indian law and how it might be useful in an ECCR toolkit or a collaborative conflict resolution toolkit. So that's March 3rd. March 24th, we will be connecting you even further with our professionals that do this work and share their examples, and who might have opportunities for mentoring or be people in the field and share some of their case studies in more depth. And then April 21st, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach, but we're going to have a dialogue about connecting ECCR with overall health and well-being in Native communities, which, by the way, was actually one of the motivations for us doing this webinar series, is that question. So that's what we've got planned. If you're interested or have people who might be interested in joining us, please send them the links. Send them our email address, which is naan@udall.gov. Ben's going to put that in the chat along with all the rest of this. The recording for today will be available, and we will be sharing that with everyone who registered, as well as posting to our YouTube channel. And I just want to thank all of you, including those that had the willingness and bravery to share, to our federal and ECCR professional partners that shared their examples: Sarah Palmer, Kurt, Dana, Seth, Marcy, Sarah Van Norman, for sharing your examples and questions. Really appreciate it. And these are more productive and better when we hear from all of you. So my gratitude to you for sharing and speaking, and for all of you joining us today on this Friday afternoon. So thank you, everyone. Can't wait to see you in March.
Thanks so much,
Stephanie.
Appreciate the opportunity. Bye, folks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Stephanie. This
Thanks,
has been
all.
great. Thanks to everyone here. I appreciated talking with you, and I'm hoping to make all the remaining 3 sessions. Bye.
Happy to see you.
Yeah.